In 1970, Nissan released a car that had no business being as good as it was. A car that came from a country still rebuilding from the ashes of war. A country with no history of building sports cars, no Formula One legacy, no racing heritage. That the world took seriously. And that car didn't just compete. It won. It became a legend. And then, in 1978, Nissan made a decision that almost destroyed everything they had built. Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to AUTOSAYS. If that already hooked you, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes, because this isn't just a car story. It's a story about what happens when a company gets it right, loses its nerve, and then gets handed one final chance to fix its biggest mistake. But first, let's go back to where this all began. It was 1969, and Yoshihiko Matsuo was a man with a problem. He was the head of Nissan's design team, and he had been handed a brief that most designers would have loved. Build a sports car. A real one. Not a rebodied sedan. Not a compromise built around a family car platform. A clean sheet, purpose-built two-seat sports car with a straight six engine. The brief was generous. The ambitions were enormous. And then the executives started talking. The executives wanted 4 seats. You'd think, at this point, someone would have pulled Matsuo aside and said, "Hey, let's just build the 2-seater." Nobody said that. And so Matsuo did something quietly remarkable. He built both. He designed the 2-seat version he believed in. Long hood, short deck, straight six, up front, and presented it alongside the 4-seat compromise. The executives picked the 4-seater. And Matsuo accepted that decision with the patience of someone who had already decided he would find another way. That car became the S30, known in Japan as the Fairlady Z, known everywhere else as the Datsun 240Z. And when it launched in 1969, for $3,526, it did something that had never happened before. It made a Japanese sports car desirable. Not competitive, not acceptable, desirable. Road and Track called it one of the best sports cars in the world. Car and Driver compared it to the Jaguar E-Type. And Americans, who had never taken a Japanese performance car seriously, started lining up at dealerships. Here's the financial picture that matters. In 1970, Nissan sold 16,215 Z cars in the United States alone. To put that in context, the Jaguar E-Type sold fewer than 3,000 units in the same market that year. The Porsche 911 sold around 4,000. Nissan had built something that didn't just compete with European sports cars. It outsold them. And it did it at less than half the price. The formula was simple, and Matsuo understood it completely. You take a beautiful body, a willing engine, a sorted chassis, and you price it so that a 24-year-old school teacher can actually drive one home. Not just look at it in a magazine, actually own it. That was the revolution, not the technology, the access. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because Nissan's success with the Z did exactly what success always does. It invited compromise. By 1974, the 240 Zest had grown. The engine got bigger. First a 2.6-liter, then a 2.8-liter. And with that growth came weight. And with the weight came more insulation, more comfort features, more of everything that buyers said they wanted in a survey, but didn't actually need in a sports car. By 1978, the S30 generation was done, replaced by the S130, the new 280ZX, and this is the part that nobody who loved the original Z talks about with a smile. The 280ZX was a fine car. It was quiet. It was refined. It had T-tops and optional power windows and a turbocharged engine that produced decent numbers on paper. Car and Driver tested it. They said it was comfortable. They said it was well built. Comfortable. That word. For a sports car, that word will tell you everything you need to know about what Nissan had done. The 280ZX had drifted. Not in the automotive sense, in the corporate sense. It had drifted away from the thing that made the Z car matter. It had drifted toward the grand tourer. The comfortable highway cruiser, the car that you chose when you wanted something sporty looking but didn't actually want to drive fast. Automotive journalists noticed. Enthusiasts noticed. Sales still held up. Americans still bought the ZX in large numbers. But the conversation had changed. The Z was no longer the benchmark. It had become a status object. And status objects don't age well. Here's what you need to understand about 1981 and about what Nissan was facing. The Japanese auto industry had spent the entire decade of the 1970s fighting for survival. The oil crisis of 1973 had reshaped the entire global market. American buyers, who had been loyal to domestic brands for generations, had discovered that Japanese cars were smaller, cheaper to run, and built to a quality standard that Detroit was struggling to match. By 1980, Japan had overtaken the United States as the world's largest automobile producer. That is not a small number. That is the entire axis of the global car industry, rotating by 30 degrees in less than 10 years. But Japan's success had also created a political problem. American automakers and American unions were watching market share disappear, and they were furious. The pressure on the US government was enormous. By 1981, the Reagan administration had negotiated what was called a voluntary export restraint agreement with Japan. The word voluntary deserves quotation marks because the alternative was formal tariff legislation that would have been far worse. Japan agreed to cap its exports to the United States at 1.68 million vehicles per year. It was a quota system dressed up in diplomatic language, and for Japanese automakers, it changed everything. When you are restricted in how many cars you can sell, you stop selling cheap cars and start selling expensive ones. Every slot in your export quota becomes more valuable. Nissan, Toyota, Honda, they all made the same calculation at roughly the same time. Stop filling quota slots with economy. Cars. Fill them with cars people will pay more for. This was the financial logic that pushed every major Japanese brand upmarket through the 1980s. And it was this logic that, in a strange and indirect way, saved the Z car. Because if Nissan was going to charge more for its cars, then the ZE, its halo product, its sports car, its brand statement, had to earn that premium. A comfortable Grand Tourer that competed with nothing and challenged no one was not the car to anchor a premium repositioning. Nissan needed the Z to mean something again. The man who would try to make that happen was Yutaka Katayama. But here is the twist. Katayama was gone by 1977. He had built the Z car's American success from the ground up. He had insisted on the low price. He had argued with Tokyo that American buyers would respond to a genuine sports car, not a compromise. He had been right, and then he had been quietly retired, the way Japanese corporate culture sometimes removes people who were too correct, too loudly. But his philosophy hadn't entirely disappeared. There were engineers inside Nissan who still believed what Katayama had believed. And in 1981, they got their chance. The Z31, which would arrive in 1983, was still 2 years away. What 1981 represents is not a new model. It represents the final, purest version of the S130 era before the transformation. The 1981 280ZX Turbo produced 180 horsepower. Not a staggering number by modern standards, but genuinely quick for its time. Quick enough to run 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds, which placed it ahead of the Porsche 924 Turbo, and within reach of the 911 SC. For a Japanese car in 1981, that was a statement. And here's the number that should stop you. In the 1981 model year, the Z was still the best-selling sports car in America. Not the Corvette, not the Porsche. The Z, for the 12th consecutive year. That number deserves to sit for a moment. 12 years. The Datsun Z in various forms had been the best-selling sports car in America for 12 consecutive years. No European car had ever done that. No American car had done that. A sports car from a country that, 30 years earlier, had no functioning car factories, had become the dominant sports car brand in the world's most important market. But what was coming next would either complete that legacy or collapse. It The Z31 was being designed. The decision had been made to go back to a turbocharged V6 to shed weight, to sharpen the steering and tighten the chassis. The engineers who had kept Katayama's faith alive had won their internal argument. Nissan was going back to what the Z was supposed to be. The question, the one that keeps automotive historians arguing even today, is whether the Z ever truly lost its way, or whether the 280ZX era was a necessary commercial bridge that kept the nameplate alive long enough for the next generation to redeem it. A car that stayed too pure might have sold too few and been cancelled. A car that compromised just enough survived to become something great again. That is the paradox of the Z car in 1981. It was, at that moment, both the end of something and the beginning of something, the last chapter of the first era, and the quiet start of the next. The Z31 Turbo would arrive in 1983 with 200 horsepower, digital instrumentation, and a completely new attitude. It would restart the conversation. But none of that happens. None of it without the 12 years that came before it. Without Matsuo drawing the body no one asked for. Without Katayama insisting on the price that made it accessible. Without the engineers who kept the faith through the Grand Tourer years and fought their way back to the driver's car. That is what the 1981 Z represents. Not a peak. Not a low point. A turning point that most people drove right past without noticing. Here's what I want to leave you with. The best car companies in history have always understood that a sports car is not just a product. It is a promise. A promise about what driving is supposed to feel like. The Z car made that promise in 1969, nearly broke it in the late 1970s, and kept it alive just long enough to honor it again. So here's the question I'll leave with you, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Was the 280ZX era a betrayal of the Z's original soul, or was it the smart commercial move that kept the nameplate alive? Because those two answers lead to very different conclusions about what Nissan actually got right. And if you want to know what happened when the Z31 arrived, when Nissan tried to rebuild everything the Z had stood for in a single model, that story is coming next, and it is not the straightforward redemption arc you might expect.